Today's lecture is going to be on the mysterious topic, the mysterious concept of the two bishops advantage. And I'm going to do my best to show you examples that show when the two bishops are at their best. So again, I will remind you, the bishops are at their best when the pawn structure is fluid, meaning the pawns can still move, the pawns can still initiate breaks, and when the board is open. The knights are best in fixed pawn structures and structures where they have central squares to occupy that are protected. Okay, not just they can get their piece to a central square, but that position, or the central square, must also be a safe square for that knight. Okay, so this very, simple example of how two bishops might be stronger than the knights is just to point out that, the two bishops in the open game are very powerful. You can see that this knight here is dominated completely by the bishop on e4, and the knight on the rim on the queen side is dominated completely by the bishop on d4. And one thing that the bishops can do very well because of their long range mobility is they can really control the whole board. And the benefit of that is also noted in the following way. So if you have two bishops versus a king, you can do checkmate. If you have two knights versus a king, you cannot force checkmate. So it just gives you an idea on the power and coordination that two bishops, one controlling each of the color square on the chessboard, brings to a position. Now the question is, how do you use them when the board is full of pieces and when a game is in progress? So that's what we're going to look at with examples. We're going to get straight to the action. Okay, so we're looking at this position fresh. We know that in the following position, black has the two bishops. White has bishop and knight, so it's not two bishops versus two knights. It's two bishops versus knight and bishop. Okay, great. So we see that that's an imbalance. Otherwise, there's no imbalance. It's 3 pawns on the queen side for each side, 3 pawns on the king side for each side. Okay? So now the way forward is the tricky thing, right? So in my chess life, I learned most of what I know from playing. I have a good chess education because I like to read chess books. Even when I was a teenager, I liked to read chess books. But I can say that I learned the most from playing my own games and analyzing my own games. And I recall in an analysis session with my coach at that time, Grandmaster Alexander Shabalov, when we were talking about, I had the two bishops advantage in a game, and he told me something simple, which for some reason, through all my years of reading books or something, I either never read or it just didn't stick with me. And it was that when you're fighting against a knight with a bishop, so here's how I see it. These bishops are counterparts to one another. The light-squared bishop doesn't have a counterpart. The knight is supposed to be its counterpart, but a knight can't really challenge a bishop like that because the knights just don't move that way. You can't use a knight to challenge a whole bishop's diagonal. So the way I see this here as black, and what Grandmaster Shabalov said is, you find the bishop that has no counterpart. That is, in this case, the light-squared bishop. And so you know that the light-squared bishop can do a lot of damage because the knight isn't going to be a great piece at controlling it. Okay? While these two bishops can fight against one another. Okay, great. The second thing he said, which I thought was even more powerful, was that you use your pawns to take away squares from the knight, and then you use your bishops to attack, right? To attack pawns, to attack the king, whatever, whatever it is you're attacking. So you use your pawns to take away squares from the knight, and then you use your bishops to attack. So, that was all great for me because I never, I never had it articulated in words to me like what you're supposed to do. I was just like, bishops are good. Everyone says that. I'll preserve them for as long as possible, and good things happen. Good things happen. Okay. So, number one, in this position, I like what Steinitz did a lot. I mean, he played pretty much a model game, a perfect game, to display the power of the bishops. So, he's controlling the open file, which is aesthetically pleasing, but I don't know how important that is right now because there are no infiltration squares, right? So there's no great way to get in there and start creating problems. So maybe that's just symbolic, the fact that black has the open file. Okay, so Steinitz says, where are the squares in the center of the board that English's knight would like to get to? Well, d4 is covered by the pawn. e4 can be covered by the pawn. And if black was able to place his pawn on f5 and c5, there would be no central squares for this knight. So that's step number one, is take away the central squares from the knight. Use your pawns to take away all central squares, all productive squares, all meaningful squares from the knight. Okay, so that's what Steinitz did. He played h6 because he wants to protect his pawn, and his idea is to advance the pawn to f5 to take away control of the e4 square. Rook to e1 was played, and he played f5. Okay, great. So I guess mini step number one has been executed by Steinitz. He opens up his bishop, that's great, and he's using his pawns to cover the central squares. f4 was played by English, and Steinitz kept the status quo, so he just played bishop to f6. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that because he's just guarding his pawn here. He doesn't want to take because if he takes, he fractures his own pawn structure. And black may even still have the advantage, but it doesn't make sense to do that. Why shoot yourself in the foot? So bishop f6. Pawn to g3. So a5. Awesome. Because the knight is extremely limited on the b3 square as is, but the idea of a5 is to further drive the knight away and open up more squares for these powerful bishops. You can see, basically, the two bishops advantage is a concept that it does take a while to get used to. But I think anyone observing this lecture right now can see why these bishops are better than the knight and bishop combination in this particular situation. So the pawn is about to drive the knight away. There's no stopping that because the knight is hanging. You can't push your pawn up. So the knight went back to c1. And Steinitz played another great move. He's like, okay, well, your knight's not coming here because my rook's guarding that. My bishops are poised at your queen side. I'm going to take another stab at your queen side. I'm going to go a5, or a5 to a4. And what I'm looking to do with this move is, if I could play the move a3, man, would that make me happy. Like, let's say black was thinking, or white was saying, okay, I'm going to go king f2. And remember, this is a little pawn chain. We'd love to attack it at its base. So pawn to a3. And this is already just absolutely horrific for white. Material is even, but black has an easy way to round up these weak pawns. And as long as all the pawns don't come off the board, these bishops are only going to gain scope after a few pawn trades, okay, as you can see. So, well, English saw that the threat of a3 was coming, and as much as he didn't want to play a3 himself, he sort of had to. Because if black could play a3, destroying the whole pawn structure, that might even be worse. So now you can really see what Steinitz has done. He has driven the knight away from any meaningful squares, and his pawns remain flexible. Like, he can still do this, he still has mobility here, but most importantly, he's nearly dominating this knight. So he plays bishop to c4. Another move I like very much, because the bishop increases its power, and similar to the position I set up for you in the introduction, which was this one, where the knight is dominated by the bishop, it's not much different here, actually, where the knight is semi-dominated, except it could go to e2. That's all. But otherwise, pretty rough situation. And if knight e2 now, there's still no place for the knight to go, thanks to f5 and c5. Remember those moves from earlier? The knight just can't find a way into the center of the board, and hence this knight will never really have a meaningful square. So king f2 was played by English. Once again, thank you to Ogrilla for the raid. Okay, so king f2 was played, and that makes sense by English, but he still has problems fighting against these bishops, and he still has issues with the knight, right? Okay, so Steinitz played pawn takes f4, which at first looks a little weird, but this forces play. First of all, you can't take with the pawn because bishop h4 check wins the exchange and some. So don't do that. He knew that white had to play bishop takes, but then he forcefully trades off his bishop for the other bishop, losing the bishop pair, but transforming the endgame into a situation where he dominates this knight on the rim with his bishop. And that's really the main part of this. He also wants to, of course, fight for control of the 7th rank, so he wants to challenge this bishop so that he can gain control of the 7th rank. So a lot of reasons that he did this. But the main reason he did this can be seen in the game continuation. So bishop takes pawn takes, and the bishop is totally dominating the knight. And I will remind you that the threat is rook to d2, which is not easy to stop. Okay, so the transformation of advantage is very common in chess. So it's like, okay, you had the two bishops advantage, but you cashed it in for just a completely winning position like this one, like liquidation into endgame that's completely winning, because you can't get this rook. So king e3 was played. And the pawn structure for white is really sad because these pawns are completely fixed. Black has an additional tempo here if he needs it, so he improves his king. And again, there's no great place for this knight. Like, for example, if you play knight to e2, you're already completely lost after rook to d3. Because king f2, rook comes to the 7th rank, and you're still in the same problem. You're losing the b pawn, you can hardly move, and your knight still has no way to gain activity in the center. So the pawns in conjunction with the bishop are just totally dominating the knight. Right? So, I mean, this is a classic example of two bishops. So h4 was played. By English, he's trying something. So we had a captures, and now Stein has beautifully calculated the following liquidation. I mean, white is busted in a lot of ways, but he did the brute force calculation, like white's almost in Zugzwang. He did the brute force calculation of rook to e8 check, trading everything. And now, mind you, what Steinitz is really doing here is he's trading into a king and pawn endgame. And you're like, no, he's not trading into a king and pawn endgame. There's still a knight on the board. But you can see that the knight will never have a place to move without it being a king and pawn endgame, because black can always just take it. And after this liquidation, Steinitz just calculated like a beast. Okay, he played king e5. Another great advantage of the two bishops is that these runaway pawns aren't as scary when you have a bishop, because a bishop with one move, it stops the pawn. A knight, it would take like 100 moves to stop the pawn. Okay, so knight to e2. Steinitz correctly liquidated. This was his whole idea. He brought the king in front of the pawn, and he just gauged that this was winning for him based on the fact that he promotes first. So let's have a look at that. So if h5 here, because he's dominating the king here, and he's got more pawn moves to spare than white does. If he pushes the pawn, king to g5 just wins because you round up the h pawn and then you're up a pawn in a king and pawn endgame. You're going to win that. So English tried the move c4, but just to show, if king to f2, we come over here and we just grab this pawn. If king to e3, we don't grab the pawn because then that would allow this, and then white would win. So you would push the pawn first, and then if the king comes forward, your pawn is just faster. Your king is already in front of the pawn, and if he tries to block your pawn, now you can grab this and guard your pawn. So you win. Okay, so that's not a challenge. The challenge here is the move c4. And this is what Steinitz had to calculate precisely. Because as Melvin says, it's very interesting that normally in a king and pawn endgame, the outside pawn wins. But the deciding factor here was after the liquidation, black's king was just so much more active. So king to g4 was played, which stops this pawn. King to e3, once again, don't grab this pawn yet, because then the king comes up to f4, and you're going to lose that. You know, you're going to lose your pawn, you're going to lose the game. So pawn to f4 check, this is the key. King to e4, pawn to f3, and the pawn promotes. For example, king e3, king g3. We call this shouldering out, where you just keep bringing your king up to guide the pawn to promotion, and you never allow the king to come over and assist. Right? So that's the idea. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.